I hope it goes well. All right, thank you. Sure.
Thank you for coming to the first post-pandemic real-life seminar in Chambers. It's very exciting to see actual human beings and not just be talking into a Zoom void. On the Zoom void are, at the moment, 285 people, but 1,000 people signed up on Zoom, and we reached our 1,000 cut-off. I have just discovered that if you have 1,000 people on Zoom, you need to open access to the webinar more than 4 minutes before it's due to start, because it's taking ages for everyone to come in gradually. And so I will just witter on for a little bit longer before we actually start the interesting bits, and that will give more of the participants online time to join in. So, apart from saying hello and thank you for coming, I have the exciting job of telling you about the emergency procedures announcement, which is only relevant to the people here in real life. If you hear an emergency alarm, it's an actual emergency, and you have to evacuate the building immediately via the staircase to the left of the lifts, but not the lifts, and then go to the meeting point, which is opposite the main entrance of Chambers, next to the higher bikes, and not come back in until someone tells you that it's safe to do so. So yeah, just head to the lifts, but don't use them, and head down the stairs instead. So we're up to 312 people of the 1,000 people who asked for the link in. The other thing to tell you, and I will then put this in the questions and answers or something, I don't know, I'll figure out something, is that the seminar is going to be recorded, and then we put our seminars online for people to watch later if they weren't able to attend them at the time. And all that means really in practical terms is that if you ask a question at the end, don't use your name unless you don't mind your name being picked up and broadcast for all time on the subsequent link. When we get to the question and answer bit, I have boldly decided that the best thing to do with this many people online and people in real life is to try and use Slido. I don't know how many of you have used it before. It's very exciting technology that means that you can all submit questions off a mobile phone or off a laptop or whatever into the same place, whether you're here in person or online. And then you can also give a sort of thumbs up to other people's questions if you think that that's a question you would also like to hear the answer to, which will then make it much easier, hopefully, assuming any of this works, for me to figure out which questions we try and get through at the end and try and prioritise them. The plan is that we will go through all of the talks first and do all of the questions at the end, but because of the magic of Slido, you could, in theory, submit your question before then, except that I need to have shown you the slide with the code number on it. So if you don't mind just holding onto your question until the end and submitting them at that stage, that would be great. Those, I think, are all the boring administrative things. The number of participants is still gradually going up. I don't really expect all 1,000 Zoom people to actually appear, because we've all signed up for things on Zoom that start at 5 o'clock and then realise that we haven't finished our work, or we actually just need to eat some dinner. But we will kick off now, and if there are any technical problems, in theory, I'm going to magically solve them. So I will be looking at the Q&A on Zoom just to make sure that there aren't any problems for the remote people. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Victoria. Thank you to everybody at 39 Essex Chambers for inviting me to chair this evening. Thank you to all of you in the room for coming. Thank you to all of the, however, 338 now on the screen for coming too. Here's a general wave. And thank you, of course, to this evening's speakers, and more of that in just a moment. Tonight's topic is an important one, and the paper we're here to consider is a very timely contribution, which I'm quite sure many of us will find an extremely useful addition to our libraries. I've undoubtedly seen a marked increase in the cases coming before me which involve issues of restraint in the care arrangements of young people with learning disabilities, and particularly with autism. I don't think that that increase is only due to heightened awareness, but I do think that heightened awareness is a very important part of how we are going to deal with this. It's often said that it's a measure of society, how it treats its most vulnerable members. And I hope very much that tonight's event will go some way to helping us to make better life experiences for everybody in our society. So we're going to start off. I'm very pleased to introduce to you Linda Hutchins. She is working with the Challenging Behaviour Foundation, and she's come to talk to you today about her real lived experience, and in particular her daughter. Linda, over to you.
Hello everyone. Actually, seeing you here, it doesn't seem such a good idea to come now. So the other thing is I'm a scout from Liverpool. I like talking, so if I'm talking too much, please let me know and I should be gone. Okay. So, right. Okay. So, no, I'm sitting down. Okay. Thank you. So today I'm going to talk about four main things. I'm going to talk about my daughter and her devastating detention under the Mental Health Act that lasted 15 years. I'm going to talk about positive behaviour support plans. I'm going to talk about the use of restraint. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about my daughter's life now and how wonderful her life is. So I'm going to stop on a really positive note. And if you want to ask me anything, feel free. So, a bit of context. My daughter was our eldest child, and like all parents, we think the sun and the moon shines out of them. We're so lucky to be parents and such a loved child. You know, she's a mostly happy kid, but she was more anxious than our other two. And so we kind of overcompensated or whatever she wanted to do with her hobbies. And we were doing them with her, and she did her art, she's really good at art. She used to sing in the school choir and she used to go and sing to the old people. And they said they were really happy to see her, but they might not have been. But she's a really happy kid. She's really happy in primary school. But what we really did notice was, we noticed the change when she went to primary school. I think a lot of people on the autistic spectrum, they find that transition from primary school to secondary school really hard. You know, her primary school was small and nurturing. It was lovely. And suddenly they go to these big, comprehensive or otherwise secondary schools where the big and the chaotic and you have to move around from different lessons and we can get real sensory overload. So I think at that point we noticed the deterioration in her mental health. Oh, sorry. I confused the two glamorous assistants here. Okay. Sorry. Okay, so as I said, she found secondary school really hard. Yeah, behaviour deteriorated. She stopped communicating with us, and we didn't know why, but we do everything we can to try to support her. I think the issues were to do with bullying. She was, because of the vulnerability, because of her autism. Yeah, she was bullied incessantly by people in school, and we didn't know. Yeah, and because my daughter, she takes everything literally. She was verbally and physically bullied, but people were saying that she was ugly and she was stupid and she was this and that. And it caused her so much trauma because it's in her brain, you see, and that kept repeating years what people said she believed them. So there was the bullying going on. It was the noise, like I said, going from different classroom to classroom. She got sensory overload. She found it really hard to cope with. It was the chaos. It was just so difficult for her. So she started to develop self-harming behaviours, and it coalesced when she took an overdose in school. Yeah, at that point it was taken out of our hands as a family because the school took her to a hospital. And I don't know how the psychiatrist come to this conclusion. It must have been by osmosis because he didn't really talk to our daughter, and he certainly didn't talk to me and my husband. They decided it was a premeditated attempt for her to take her own life. We were told at that point that she had to go into hospital. If she didn't go as a voluntary patient, she would be sectioned under the Mental Health Act. And if we disagreed with that, me and my husband, because she's 14 and we had some limited rights, they would take us to court and we would have our parental rights overturned. We had no choice. And you know, and I can't emphasise this enough, it's really important. At that time, it was austerity, yeah? Local authorities, they were being squeezed, so we said to the social services, please, and health, give us this care package and we'll keep her at home, because we knew the right place for our daughter was with us. But no, she had to go into hospital. And I can't tell you how devastating it was, because she's 14 and she's crying and she's saying to me, please don't leave me. Don't leave me. I won't do it again. I want to come home. And he had to leave her. And he come home, and you know what? I saw in his face my husband aged because of leaving our daughter there. Okay. And at this point, life got really bad for our daughter, you know. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how hospital is so toxic and devastating for people with learning difficulties and people who are not on the autistic spectrum. So our daughter was in the hospital. Still on the right side. So she's in hospital. And that was devastating because she was surrounded by acutely ill people. Yeah. Now, the emphasis, it changed from her being the positive person that she was by and large, with friends that were really important to her. And it turned into an emphasis on being ill. Yeah. And because she was so scared in that really unpredictable environment, she started to copy behaviours. So she learned new ways to self-harm. She didn't have an eating disorder, but when they put her in hospital, because it was a unit that specialised in treating people who had eating disorders, she developed an eating disorder. And again, it was devastating because they fed her through a nasogastric tube. And for someone with sensory issues, can you imagine how terrible that is? You know, 16th birthday, she was in isolation. Her friends had stopped coming because we couldn't bring her home anymore. And they found it so difficult because they were surrounded, you know, bells would be going, oh my God, bells would be going, people would be screaming. She's even more isolated and lonely, you know. As I told you, that the flavour of why it was so hard, it was unpredictability. You know, these hospitals are mostly staffed by support workers. Now, I'm not doing them down because they work really damn hard for very little money. But at the end of the day, because they're so badly paid, they work really long shifts. Yeah, and many of them are not properly trained. You know, so we had unpredictability because these people who were very badly trained, yeah, they were trying to keep her safe. Yeah. So there was the unpredictability, there was the noise, there was the bullying that she underwent, and she ended up in 16 in isolation. Went to see her for her 16th birthday, and it was devastating. We brought her friends and her sisters to see her, and she was gone in its own world of trauma, and we were telling the same jokes that, you know, was said about when she bumped off school and she went to the shop and ran into the caretaker. She wasn't very, but she's gone. So the next day she was, and it felt so awful because the next day she went to another hospital even further away, and those bonds were even weakened. Yeah, so she went to this next hospital. And my daughter doesn't lie, and what she told us was that they put her in a padded cell, they injected her, and they gave her electric shock therapy. Yeah. And that was a treatment plan. After that, her mental health broke down even more, if that was possible. She spent the next 13 years in different institutions. Yeah, I think the most devastating one for her was a hospital where, again, they put her in isolation. And I know this was true because I had to force my way to go and see her. And it just talking to her now, it caused me trauma because how they treated her. She was in an attic bedroom for 9 months. Yeah, and I went to see her in that room and there was no comfort, there was no love, there was no care. She was sleeping on a bed, rubberised sheets, rubberised gown. The only thing she had was a television. You know when you're sick, it's so important to have television. It didn't even work, flickering on and off. And later she told me that one of the nurses actually said to her, you know what, you're an attention seeker, because they're so badly trained in autism. You're an attention seeker. You think it's bad here, wait till you get on my ward. You're going to get so much worse for you. Now, what is that? I ask you here, what is that? If not, well, it's bullying, but it's abuse. Yeah, it's psychological and institutional abuse. After that, she was taken to another hospital. And she was on a really heavy dosage antipsychotic drug called clozapine. Now, you tell me why she's on clozapine. Because she wasn't psychotic. Her symptoms were to do with being in hospital that was so devastating for her. This antipsychotic induced seizures. She had a devastating fall. She broke her foot in 2 places. Instead of offering her a surgical option, which she didn't want to do because it took too much time, they give her a boot. Now, my daughter's a pacer, you see, because to do this stretch piece up and down, she put the strap on the boot, didn't give her another one. And now she walks with a limp. Yeah, I've got to tell you, my daughter was so fit. We've got a mountain boot. She used to go up on mountains with my husband. And you see that strong, healthy young woman, you know, in the prime of her life, so happy. And now she walks with a limp. You go around the shop and she's in pain. It's outrageous. It wouldn't happen to you and me, yeah? But why should it happen to someone who's vulnerable? Yeah. Anyway, after that, she went to a final hospital and things changed at that point. Yeah, and that's where the Positive Challenging Behaviour Foundation came in, because they linked me up with media people and the legal people, and we had a successful campaign to get our daughter released. Yeah. What happened at that point as well is she had what's called a care and treatment review. Yeah, and that was really, really important because they looked at why she was in hospital, should she be in hospital, and what do they need to do to get her out of hospital. Yeah, and now I'm going to talk a little bit about positive behavioural support plans, only a little bit, because these lovely people here have written a really excellent paper on it. But as I understand it, a positive behavioural support plan, it's a care plan, but it's a care plan that puts the patient right in the middle of it. And it's formed by really rigorous assessments of what the person's needs are. I see it as being collaborative, so you bring in the people of that person, they're important in their life. It's proactive, so it's developing really important strategies to help them manage the difficulties. And it's preventative, because when you've got those strategies, you can help people manage that behaviour that seems challenging. As a result of the care and treatment review, they did 2 really, really important things. They did a sensory assessment and a speech and language assessment. So once they did that, we had a proper care and treatment plan because they really understood how my daughter sees the world. It was like we were all blind. You know what I mean? We were blind. We didn't know how our autism affected her. So the speech and language assessment, for the first time it was collaborative. We spent 6 sessions with my daughter, and they come and saw my husband at our home and we spoke to us. They come to our house twice, and we realised that Jade had a real difficulty with language. It wasn't that we constantly told our daughter I'd learned rubbish. yeah. She had a speech and language difficulty. She had autism, and it's not a disability, it's just a difference in the brain how she's wired up. Yeah. So we understood how she processed language. So once we found that out, yeah, it was transformative. So the staff were trained in their autism. They were told to use clear, plain language. Don't use metaphors. I've got an example. Our daughter used to do drama, yeah, and she was going to she was going to a rehearsal once, and my brother was there, and he said, "Oh, good luck, break a leg," yeah. And afterwards, she was devastated because she was saying, "Why does my Uncle Paul want me to break a leg?" You know, she didn't understand. But when we understood how she saw the world in those ways, it was absolutely transformative, yeah, because the other thing, she doesn't understand non-verbal communication. So she'd say, "Is that a happy face or a sad face?" But when we knew all about that, for the first time she had a meaningful positive behavioural support plan, yeah, and the incident of challenging behaviour, it went out, it's like transformative, yeah, because that plan, it did things like all the staff were trained, yeah, with Nhs autism. We knew that she found early evening really difficult because that's a time of uncertainty when new staff come in for the night shift. She didn't know who she was going to get, yeah. So because they were all trained in Nhs autism, yeah, they could support her effectively, and she only had Acute supporting her around that time, and everybody was trained, even the bank staff, and only bank staff who knew well were allowed to work. When she found things difficult, they did very positive things, like she could have a sensory toy, she was allowed to adjust the lighting in a room, you know, just really little things that made such a huge difference. And an instance of challenging behaviour, dramatically, it was like switching it, you know, it's just, I can't tell you how dramatic and how important it all was. And it was like, at that point, game on, we were getting her out. And that's what it was like. And I'm sure I've got some really important things to tell you, but I've forgotten. Oh God, that's the really important things. Yeah, right. So, I've got to say, the treatment that they gave to my daughter was appalling. One of the things is that people with autism and learning difficulties, they deserve better. Yeah, and I'm sorry about this, it's emotional, but I think it's a stain on our society, quite frankly, how we allow this abuse to go on. Yeah, but I'm going to be positive, okay? These are all my positive things, yeah? Once we had a positive behavioural support plan, yeah, like I say, it was game on. I've got to tell you about restraint. So my daughter was restrained multiple times, and she got significant trauma around men because one of the things that happened to her in secondary school, we didn't know, she's bullied by a group of boys. Yeah, so the worst thing you can do to my daughter is physically impose on her personal space, and that was what was happening multiple times by sometimes up to 6 people, including males, prone on the floor. And what that did is that just reinforced the trauma all over again. Yeah, but I said I'm going to talk about some positive things. There's positive things that transformed my daughter's life was that we got proper funding. Yeah, we got an organisation that provides a care package, and they started to work with her. So they did everything right. They started to work with her 6 months before she got out. So she really built up that positive relationship. She lives in her own home. She loves her home. She had a real say in how, you know, the decor, how we like to decorate it. She's got all the family photographs. It's wonderful. She lives half a mile, 30 minutes drive from us. And we see her whenever she wants to, but it's under her terms, because she's a woman. And it's absolutely wonderful. I tell you this story. I was so happy when she got drunk.
I think perhaps we've got to stop. Can we save that story for
That's right. Yeah, so, okay, she got drunk, milestone, fantastic, yeah. It's her home, yeah. It means so much to her. You know, she has her friends, she has her sisters. She's a woman transformed since leaving her. She's lost 7 stone. Yeah, she's such a beautiful young woman. She has her nails on her hair. She's so glamorous.
There's your photos, isn't she?
Oh, there you go.
Isn't she beautiful?
Yeah.
Absolutely, that's my daughter, 2 of them. Yeah. Everybody dares to say she isn't.
They will get evicted.
They will. You see that? She's got a sunflower there. Yeah. She's got a tattoo. And I'm so pleased because she's covering a scar. But it's a really, really wonderful way to say, you know what? I've turned my life around, you know, and she's becoming the woman that she should have been before all those years were stolen away. And I'm so happy. It's transformative for all our family. And if that's not positive enough, she's on holiday this week and she's going to Spain in October. No, sorry.
We could go on for hours hearing about something. It's lovely to end on a happy note and leave it there. Can I move us on at this point to build on the positive behavioral talk from a different angle, if that's all right? Yes. Yeah. Oh, no, sorry. Do you want to go next?
More slightly more sense.
Yeah. I don't need to introduce you. Thank you.
Right, you get me next. I'm Victoria Butler-Cole, and you only get me for a very short period of time because you're more interested in what Dr. Joyce has to say than me. And what I wanted today, just very briefly, was to explain why Dr. Joyce ended up being cajoled into writing a paper that has both our names on it, which is, as you can tell from reading it, obviously mostly hers. And that is that so many of the cases that see legal protection include what are called PBS plans. And so many of the cases involve people with learning disabilities who may also have autism. And we're told that the restraint that is authorised in these plans is necessary and proportionate and in their best interests. And yet we've all seen cases where we've been told that, and then something has changed in the person's care arrangements. They've moved to a new setting, they've got different carers in place, and suddenly they're not being restrained. And you know after the event that that was just wrong. It wasn't necessary and proportionate, but you didn't have a way of being able to persuade a local authority, a CCG, or a judge of court protection, possibly, that that was the case. And so the goal in writing the paper was to try and help us as practitioners to know what we should be expecting to see and what questions we should be asking to try and figure out whether, when we're told that restraint is necessary and proportionate and in someone's best interest, whether that's actually true or not. And one of the very early cases that I remember doing involved a woman who will always stick in my mind because she'd been in institutions and she had eventually ended up in a care home in an annex of her own. And she was being physically restrained repeatedly. And we had disclosure of all of the records and looked at them. And one of the incidents that just really sticks in my mind, she was restrained for 2 to 3 hours by a number of staff. And when you went back to the documents to find out why, it had all started because one afternoon she was sitting on her sofa with her feet on the sofa. And the carer said to her, "Take your feet off the sofa." And that had escalated from, take your feet off the sofa in your own home. Yes, it's a care home, but it's your own home where you're perfectly entitled to put your feet on the sofa. Take your feet off the sofa to hours of physical restraint. And in that case, an independent social worker did a phenomenal report, pages and pages and pages of incredibly detailed analysis of all of these incidents, which led to the inevitable conclusion that none of this restraint was necessary or proportionate, and all of it was being required because the way in which she was being cared for was completely wrong. And that's great, but we don't always get a massively detailed independent social work report or a psychology report. And practically, we can't probably have those reports in every single case because there aren't enough experts to go round. So that's the goal of the paper, and Dr. Joyce is going to speak about the content of it. The other thing that I've done, which is in real life on your chairs, but for the people online will be circulated electronically afterwards, is a paper with Nyasha Weinberg in Chambers, one of our new tenants, about the sort of case law and guidance in relation to restraint. And the paper starts with this quote, which I'm just going to read out because the people online can't read it for themselves. And it's a quote from a document produced by the Royal College of Psychiatrists in 2018. And it says, research into the factors that contribute to aggressive behaviour in residential settings find that most instances are not caused directly by the person's psychopathology, in quotes. Most are fully understandable at the human and interpersonal level and are due to everyday frustrations that come from communal living in a setting where people lack autonomy and control over their lives. If staff can create an environment that minimises these general frustrations and work with individuals to identify and anticipate specific triggers that cause them distress, they'll reduce the need to resort to restrictive interventions. And it sounds really blindingly obvious, but we're still told in so many cases that there isn't anything that can be done. There aren't any more changes to the environment that can be made. And this really is something that satisfies those tests of being necessary and proportionate. And the test of necessity is such a strict test. And yet, I think often we're not really being given the correct answer to that question. So the paper summarises the very sparse case law from either the Court of Protection or anywhere else about any of this. There's really not very much to go on. And then flags up some of the professional guidance that exists, none of which is terribly useful either, because we have different definitions of restraint in different places. We have government guidance which says you probably shouldn't ever use prone restraint, but oh, hang on, maybe you can a few paragraphs later. And so we don't have clarity on any of these really fundamental questions. And then we have knowledge from the recent CQC report on the Out of Sight programme about the fact that there isn't enough training, that the training isn't good enough, that there's no national reporting system, that people are still using prone restraint, that people get stuck in a cycle of using restraint and can't get out of it. And also, I think really importantly, that commissioners, local authorities and CCGs were not always aware of levels of restrictive practice. And I think that's a massive understatement from my experience. Local authorities and CCGs have barely any idea what's actually going on the ground, because this exercise of getting all the documents, reading all the ABC charts, putting two and two together and figuring out what's going on simply doesn't happen. And I have a case at the moment where he's been subject to repeated physical restraint since February, and we're still waiting for the psychology services to look at any of that and express a view about whether what's happening could be stopped in some way. So those are all just sort of resources that might be useful, but hopefully even more useful than all of them will be hearing from Dr. Joyce and being able to ask questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victoria. I think it falls to me to give some brief introductions to Dr. Joyce, who is a clinical psychologist and has been a clinical psychologist for many years in the NHS, and subsequently for 6 years working with the CQC. She was a prime mover in the Out of Sight report, that you may be familiar with, but now she works independently. She's often an expert witness, and she works directly with adults with behaviour that challenge. And that's just skating over the ice of what she does actually. But I think best if I leave it to you now. Thank you very much, Dr. Joyce.
Thank you, thanks. And thanks everybody for coming and giving me the opportunity to talk about the work that Tora and I have done on writing this paper. And I wanted to start off by saying that the note we've written is based on evidence. And some of the evidence is some research evidence and clinical evidence, and some of the evidence is also my own experience and experience of other people. But I think the most profound evidence we've seen earlier today because actually real life experience is what tells us what we need to do and how to do it. So when this actually happened, because I think it was on Twitter, wasn't it, or somebody said, oh, another care plan, they've done something, and you made a comment, and I emailed back saying, but we could be doing it better, honestly, we could. And the thing that really got me was that I spent a lot of time in CQC going to see people who were living in pretty appalling circumstances, and they had a care plan that did not really address their needs, and often wasn't based on evidence. And some of them had been in segregation for 2 years, and there was no plan to get them out. And some people were being restrained quite regularly. A lot of them were autistic. They were living in a toxic environment that was not therapeutic in any sense. And yet, the sense was that this is essential, this is necessary. So we felt we needed to try and put something out there that would say, is this really what the best we can do, and is it the thing we should be doing? So we wanted to provide assistance to people who have to scrutinise care plans in court. And given that actually I do appear in court, maybe I've not done myself any favours at all, and I should have written something completely different. So we'll pick that one time. So the focus is on what may be needed when these care plans are being examined and actually potentially approved by the court. And my specific area is people with learning disabilities who may or may not also be autistic. And the point that's always struck me is that policy and practice say that restraint should only be used as a last resort, and when all other methods of responding to the behaviours of challenge have failed to be effective. And that's what we're always told, that's what guidance says, it's a last resort. And the court may be asked to approve care plans that include the use of restraint as part of the person's support and treatment. And I actually think it can be quite difficult to challenge or counter that statement, especially if they're being proposed by the professional team around the person. In a sense that, what you all know to counter what the professional says. It's a very hard thing to do. So our aim was to try and give you some stuff you could say to counter that professional view. Just briefly, I think we probably know all this, but there's no harm in reminding ourselves. What do we know about the use of restraint for behaviours that challenge in learning disability services? Okay, the Challenging Behaviour Foundation and Positive and Active Behaviour Support Scotland produced a report in 2019. I've actually written down the data because I wouldn't be able to remember it. Parents responded, 204 children, 88% of children are being restrained, 68% of them in schools. 21% of children secluded on a daily basis. There were poor staff skills. Parents weren't always told, and it wasn't reported in most cases. So we have a big issue going on here. Somebody somewhere is saying this should happen and could happen. We've got Nhs Digital Data, which is published every month, and sheet 18 it tells you how many people have been restrained. The data came out in March, probably for December. Remember, there are about just over 2,000 people with learning disabilities in hospitals at the moment, probably a bit more than that. 380 people have been restrained in the previous month. The majority of them were under 34. So we're talking about a young population as well. And actually, when you think about the trauma that Linda has talked about, that's actually important to remember. And some of them were children. Most common was physical restraint, and it's all broken down into ever many categories you can think of in restraint. There's a line for it. There's the out of sight report from CQC in 2021, which you've already mentioned. And I think the point we need to make, actually, because there's no oversight really in social care, in supported living or residential care for the amount of restraint that goes on, and the CQC are worried about it. But I have to say also the hospital reporting is an under-report because they don't have to report. And we really don't know what's going on in schools. And I'm saying to you as legal people that actually you may be the only people providing external scrutiny of the care plans and the use of restraint, people who are outside of the service. And I think that bears thinking about when you look at the care plans. There's others, the House of Lords Joint Committee on Human Rights report, which looked at the detention of young people with autism. The Health and Social Care Committee reported last year similarly saying too much detention, too much restraint. There's media reports, Kent County Council recently, in the case of Samuel and Jacob, who were put in a restraining chair several hours a day. Patient A, who was in what was euphemistically called an apartment. I don't know if any of you saw the photos, but it didn't really look much like an apartment I want anyone in my family to rent. There's a case of Bethany, who was there from Hatch, etc., etc., etc. So this is not new. This has been going on a while. So what can we do? I thought at this point it might just be a bit useful to say something about what are behaviours that challenge and why do they occur, because I think it helps in trying to think through what do we need to ask and why we need to ask it. These are described as behaviour problems, and they were brought to the person, so it implies that behaviour is a problem for the person, and you will all have come across it possibly, you know, it was just part of that person, they were a problem and their behaviour was part of a problem. It was changed to challenging behaviour in 1995, and that was part of the institutionalisation programme, which is a shift focus from the person whose behaviour is challenging to the care and support they're receiving. It's not an endemic part of them, it's not integral to them, it's something about the way they've been looked after. And the most recent 2007 PBS, Royal College and Royal College of Speech and Language therapists adapted that and said behaviour can be described as challenging when it is of such an intensity, frequency or duration as to threaten the quality of life, important but first, and or the physical safety of the individual or others, and it is likely to lead to responses that are restrictive, aversive or result in exclusion. So it's in a sense being judged by its consequences. The behaviour that the person exhibits, demonstrates, shows, does, is a challenge to the way that support's being delivered. Therefore, the responsibility for it resides more with the service and the support than with the person whose behaviour challenges. The behaviour occurs because the person's needs aren't being met, and I think we heard that earlier. And I think, I'm a psychologist, I'm going to talk about learning. Behaviour is learnt, okay? And it serves a function for the person, and the function is to communicate an unmet need. So behaviour that challenges is communicative. So if you come across people with behaviour challenges and they haven't had communication assessment, you might want to ask why. Briefly, the functions, so that it makes sense when you read the reports, they've been broadly defined as four. The first is sensory. The person engaged in behaviours that make them feel better by creating an internal reaction. Function is to impact on their own internal state. Jade likes to pace. Some people like to twirl. Some people do all sorts of stuff, but actually it can be a way of internally regulating your state or your state to reduce anxiety. It can be a request for access to items or activities, food, drink, something to do. It can be a request for social interaction. And I still remember, you know, when people are told they're attention seeking, it's like, you shouldn't be wanting any attention. What sort of human being are you that you want people to pay attention to you? It's actually nonsense when you really unpack it. And the fourth one is escape or demand avoidance in the jargon. So a person finds a situation which could include sensory stimulation too difficult in their behaviour as a means of escaping from it. And it's important to know these because actually if you know that's the function, you can then do something about it. An example, okay, how does the person learn it? I'm sitting in my residential care place and suddenly there's a real lot of noise and there's people coming and going and I don't know what to do and I throw a chair. Suddenly staff come to me and say, oh, what's the matter? And they take me away from the place that's too noisy. And it's worked. Next time it's too noisy, I'm going to throw a chair. And I might learn a few more things I can do to get away from the place that's too noisy. Or I might want a cup of tea, so I sort of go and break a cup or do something or shouting and screaming. And someone says, you're right, do you want a cup of tea to calm down? So you think next time I want a cup of tea, I might do that again. So it's learned. But it's also manageable because what you do is you set up a system that says, we know this person is going to find this environment too noisy. So we will make sure that if it becomes noisy, we remove them before they become challenging. If then we know they get thirsty every 2 hours, and some people do, we will make sure you have a cup of tea 1 hour in. So you can build the environment around the person based on their needs that actually makes it much less likely that they're going to need to do that stuff. Does this make sense? It's always worth checking. So, having said that, we need to talk about PBS plans. And they're a way in which appropriate support for the person whose behaviour is challenged is developed, planned and delivered. And their use has been recommended by a number of policy and guidance documents, and they're frequently included in an overall care plan. And they actually should be if you're talking about somebody whose behaviour is challenged. And I'm going to acknowledge that autistic people have raised concerns about the use of plans that seek to manage behaviours that challenge, especially when they include aversive or punishment responses. And I would say that it's important to understand that PBS is important and that it absolutely rejects the use of aversive methods or punishments. And if there are questions that people want to ask me about that later, then I think fine to ask them. So what is it? It's a blend of person-centred values and behavioural science and uses evidence to inform decision-making. Behaviour that challenges usually happens for a reason and may be the person's only way of communicating an unmet need. PBS practitioners aim to understand the reason for the behaviour so as to better meet people's needs, enhance their quality of life and reduce the likelihood that the behaviour will happen. So, what could you expect to be in the plan? And I just, how all of you, I'm just taking a punch. Most of you seen care plans in your practice? Most of you think they're good, bad, indifferent, not sure? Okay. Interesting. And would it have been helpful to know what you should be looking for, I suppose, is the question. Okay, what a PBS plan, which may be a category within the overall care plan, because certainly a local authority care plan will have all sorts of other stuff in it. But a PBS plan is quite a specific part of it. And if somebody is coming to court or in a situation where we're asking and saying we think they should be restrained, then there should be a very clear, well thought out and well done PBS plan. So what should be in it? So there should be proactive stuff in it. There should be a lot of assessment of the person's life, what's important to them, their needs, their behaviours, the assessment of functions of behaviours, how the history and current support interact with their needs. It's really, it has to be person-centred, it has to be based solely on that person's individual circumstances and needs. You have to have a whole view of the person. They're not just their behaviour, though they often can be reduced to that. And you have to think about how to plan a good quality of life. Communication, there should be a really good communication assessment. If we're saying behaviours are challenging because people can't communicate their needs, then it's up to us to find a way of helping them. And also teaching additional skills. We need to teach, there should be something about teaching additional skills so that people can have more control over their lives. If I've constantly got to wait for someone to come and do something for me, but I could learn to do it for myself, I will have so much more control and a better life. And then a big one, especially for people autistic, is environmental management. And arranging it to minimise risk, for example, reducing noise, making sure there's routine so that when the transition comes in the evening, it's been well planned. The routine is not going to be a trigger for distress and uncertainty. It's actually managed beforehand. There should also be preventive and reactive strategies. So you should know what the early warning signs for increasing distress are. You should know how to de-escalate that person, which means you need to know the function. Because actually, if de-escalation, if you think what they want is a cup of tea, but actually they want is to leave, and all you do is make them stay and give them a cup of tea, that's not going to work as a de-escalation strategy. And then focus support to prevent it, and then what to do if it happens. And the first bit of that, hopefully, won't be restraint. There should be post-incident support, staff training and support, and monitoring review, and that should all be in the plan. We've talked about staff training, and it may not appear in the PBS plan, but it's certainly something that could be asked about when you're scrutinising these particular situations. It should be related to the individual who's being supported. A few days of generic introduction to PBS is unlikely to be sufficient to provide effective support for a person whose behaviour is challenging and where restrictions and restraint are being implemented, but it's very common, a few generic days. So they need to understand functions of behaviour, communication, sensory needs, how to use this knowledge to support the person. I think I left sensory needs off the assessment. It's in the questions, but I might have just made it as a typo. Sensory assessment is crucial because unless you know the person's finds noise or lights or flickering lights or colours really difficult, you can put them in an environment that's really toxic to them. So it's absolutely crucial. It's in the paper if it's not on the slides. They need to use this knowledge to support the person so that challenging behaviour isn't needed as a means of communicating their needs. You need to have mechanisms for staff support and supervision. Agency staff need to be aware and trained. And I have to say, increasing the staff ratio from 1:1 to 2:1 to 3:1 really works. And if you're autistic, it's probably really not very good for you. And I have to say, I was recently involved in a situation where the staffing was creeping up and ended up at 10:1. So it's not a good solution, I think, is what I'd say. So training in PBS needs to be comprehensive. However, frequently it consists of mainly preventative and reactive strategies, not proactive. So people are being taught to de-escalate and they're being taught to manage the behaviour, but they're not taught to do the stuff that you need to do to make the rest of your life worth living so you don't need to become challenging. It's insufficiently based on detailed assessment of the person, and frequently it includes methods of physical restraint. And I have to say, if you're a member of support staff and you get 3 days training on PBS and a day and a half of it is how to restrain someone, you're going to think, yeah, that's what I should be doing because that's what I'm being trained to do. I've not been trained about communication or sensory needs or functions. I'm trained to restrain. So the thing for me is it a last resort? And I think this is where maybe the lawyers among you will tell you about best interests and etc., whether it can be someone's best interest to be restrained if it's not a last resort. So I think all of this hopefully has indicated that restraint is only used when all other support strategies to reduce an individual's distress have been tried and failed. And this is usually taken to mean that proactive, preventive and non-restrictive reactive management strategies have been tried and failed. But actually, it's important to confirm what proactive strategies are in place, how they're being implemented, whether staff know how to deliver them, how they're being monitored for effectiveness. Without these steps being in place, it's not reasonable, in my view, to state that restraint has been used as a last resort, either generally or on a specific occasion. Which is paragraph 33 in that paper. We don't have a viewpoint about this, you can tell, can't you? Okay. You're being caught or you're being challenged or something. So we've actually got quite a few questions, but I've just taken a few of them out to give you an idea of what you might ask. So some questions and what you might look for. So, Mr. X, what assessments have been undertaken to understand the functions of P's behaviour? And the sorts of things you would want to hear are, we've assessed the functions of the behaviours of P. We've done a really good communication assessment. We've done a sensory assessment, and that's really important because they're autistic. We've looked at their skills, we've done an assessment of that. We've looked at what things they enjoy and what things they don't enjoy. We've looked at what they want in their life. We've done a really good health assessment because actually health can have an implication in terms of people's behaviour. When I was at TQC, we found a care plan that said this person's very challenging and they're being segregated. I only saw the care plans of people being segregated. And they said, oh my God, he's got scoliosis, which is probably causing him a lot of pain, but there was no treatment anywhere in the plan for it. So health assessments are very important. Mental health assessment as well, because actually, as Linda said, you could start off with behaviour that challenge, you could start being autistic, and it's not long before you actually become very anxious, very depressed, very stressed. Really important, there's collaborative with the family, and you really take notice of what the family says. So if none of that's in place, or any help that's in place, it's worth asking a question. Then what do you understand? And then not just what the assessments, but what do you understand to be the function? What is these assessments taught you? And so they should be able to describe the functions of the behaviours and how to meet P's needs in a way that means they don't need to engage in behaviours that challenge. I have seen care plans where all the behaviours have all the functions. So somebody throws something, it's because they want attention, they don't want attention, they want something to eat, and it's too noisy. Well, that doesn't help you at all because you deal with something that says that, but it fills in a paragraph. How does the PBS care plan address the need to develop more appropriate methods of communicating? Is it on the basis of assessment? What supports are in place? There's a range of possible supports in place. I'm running out of time, so how has this been put together as a coherent plan? What proactive strategies are in place? So improving quality of life, teaching skills, adapting the environment, all the stuff we've talked about. How often is restraint used? What are the plans to reduce it? It's really important. They should be able to produce good quality data. What training have the staff had? And it should be individually based and it should be happening fairly often so that people get refreshed. So the final thing you get asked is whether to approve the use of restraint. And I think what I want to say is restraint has significant consequences for the person who's being restrained. And it can be presented as an inevitable part of the person's support. PBS plans are frequently presented without consideration of proactive methods that demonstrate understanding of the reasons for the behaviour and could prevent the need for the behaviour to occur. So instead, they focus on strategies to deal with behaviour when the person's already becoming distressed. So care plans should include appropriate PBS plans. If they don't do this, then have they addressed these needs appropriately? They should all be available to the court. They should be in papers. And my question to you is, should restraint be considered as a last resort when methods of making it unnecessary have not been implemented? Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Would you like to come and take a seat, because I'm quite sure there are going to be lots of questions. Thank you very much indeed. even though you tried to forestall the questions by putting them in paper. Anyway, just give you time to settle down again there. Are there back to the paper slide? Okay. So Victoria's doing the techie stuff. I'll start by doing the low-tech stuff. Is there anybody in the room who would like to ask a question of either Dr. Joyce or of Linda Hutchins? Great, that means I can. Dr. Joyce, you kind of invited this one when you mentioned that autism support groups sometimes challenge the use of PBS plans, particularly if they use, I think the word you used was punitive measures in them. How, you seem positive about these plans, so how should these lawyers be distinguishing what makes a good PBS plan and what are the valid concerns of the autism support groups?
Okay, there's two things I say. A PBS plan shouldn't have aversive or punishment strategies within it, and actually it shouldn't be necessary. But I'm also aware that sometimes, and I've been involved in a case recently where restraint had been happening, and actually we knew it was going to have to continue while we put the PBS stuff in place, but there should be a plan to get out of it. So I would say fundamentally we shouldn't be using restraint, and I think we know that. I mean, I think it's a sort of rights issue as well, isn't it? Why would we treat people who are vulnerable in a way that sort of, anyway, I'm talking to lawyers, so I won't go down that road. The second thing is that as I understand it, and quite rightly, I think that there's a sense that if somebody's autistic, then they shouldn't have to keep adapting. They shouldn't have to keep making the changes. People should be a bit more aware of their needs and actually try and adapt to their needs rather than the autistic person having to do all the changing. And I would say that a PBS plan, properly developed and implemented, does exactly that. Because it says what this person needs is a quiet environment, or an environment that hasn't got any red flashing lights in it, or an environment that hasn't got this particular smell. And they need staff who understand that they can become distressed and that we're going to do everything we can to change what's going on around you so that you don't need to become distressed, because we understand your needs. So actually a proper PBS plan would be doing the things I think that are the issues that cause some concern to autistic people. I know I've spoken to people who have been in hospital and feel they've been treated in a very punishing way, and it's been said it's a PBS plan. So they've got quite a bad press in some places. But I think if they're done properly, then there's very little difference between them.
Thank you very much. Any follow-up or any others? An independent question here? Yes, go ahead.
I'm coming from a slightly different field from some people in the room, coming from advocacy. So we're going to interface with those care plans a lot more frequently. I'm aware of them. What I've seen is people attempting to do that without underpinning it with an appropriate level of assessments. If we're coming across these care plans and we see that they lack that crucial element, what would you recommend as a direction to go? Because it's not clear which professional you would ask to assist. Would we go to a regular OT or psychologist? Is there anything you could recommend?
I'm going to say, as we said before, it's not always easy to get specialists. And actually, the work is specialist, but once you've got an understanding of it, I'd also say it's not nuclear physics.
So it's teachable.
It's teachable.
So actually, teams could spread information.
I think there's a lot of places have intensive support teams. Most teams will have a psychologist. There are some independent companies that will provide that assessment for you. So there are ways of accessing it. I mean, the first of all, the ways I think the local statutory services, because I think you have to do with the format and waiting lists. But if somebody is actually in a bad place and being restrained a lot, then I think we've got justification as an advocate saying push them up this.
Thank you very much. Now I build on that. You've given a great emphasis on the need for training to be able to put together one of these good PBS plans. Who should be putting together a PBS plan, and what kind of certificate of training should we be looking for?
Okay, then psychologists do it, some behaviour trained nurses will do it, and then there is board certified behaviour analysts, which is a recognised profession in this country, but actually there are board certified behaviour analysts who can also do the assessment that's needed. So there's a sort of more of a range. It's not just a psychologist. I mean, there are other professions who can do it, and people may have done specific training courses, like done a master's at TISOC or somewhere, and learned how to do it.
Yes.
Well, this is just to follow on from that. So would you say that if a social worker is doing this plan, we would be wanting to see what specific training they'd had around developing a positive behaviour support plan? Or, for example, if it's like a community learning disability team where there are social workers and, you know, psychologists and things, but it's being done by the social worker, should we be saying this needs to be done by psychologists?
I think if a social worker is doing it, it'd be worth asking what support and supervision they're getting to help them do it in that way. It sounds like I'm not really, but I think people are asked to do things that they know need to be done, and they're often quite difficult to do, and they do their best. So I'm not knocking anyone, but I'm saying there does need sometimes to be somebody who's behind it saying, no, what about this, what about that? Because it feels very difficult to do it if you don't. You'll know if you feel incompetent or you feel you've been asked to do something that you're not quite ready to do. It's very stressful and not very helpful to anybody. So I wouldn't say no social worker would do it, because actually individuals may have done training themselves, they may have lots of experience, they may have people to talk to. But generally you would expect some training. And actually a PBS plan's collaborative, so you'd expect a speech and language therapist to contribute to it, you'd expect the social worker to contribute it, you'd expect the OT to contribute to it. It's not owned by any one profession, it's owned by all of them. Ownership's the right word, and especially the person. So it's not, don't just go for psychology, loads of other people do lots of assessment as well.
Thank you very much. Can we take a virtual person?
Well, I was going to say that leads very nicely to one of the questions that someone online has asked, which is how often do you see good care plans and PBS plans that have actually done all of these things? Is there a lot of best practice out there? And obviously, as a lawyer, one only sees the cases that come to court, but my answer to that would be never. And I don't know whether...
I've seen some very good ones,
yeah,
actually. And the good ones are when people have got the skill and knowledge, but also the time to really spend with the person, because that's what it means. It's not something you can come in and do in a day. You know, doing the assessment of the functions of behaviour, communication assessment, Linda was saying, took 6 separate sessions and 2 sessions with you. These things take time to do them well. And so I want to emphasise again that the whole PBS is a very collaborative approach of all professions, and everybody's skills are really informed and developing.
And the thing I want to say is, you mentioned the professionals, and it was also absolutely transformative when that especially the sensory assessments and speech. You know, my daughter's challenge in behaviour, she was so complex, she's so high risk, she didn't go out for months. It was very transformative, that change that they make. What the other thing I want to say about the collaborative process that I really keep people involved in this appearance and loved ones. You know, I think they're crucial as well, and I think sometimes that gets overlooked as well. It's very easy to bother the parents by professionals, but I say we're key to it as well.
On that point, maybe you might like to see the first 2 bits of the blue up there for you. Thank you very much.
Oh, great.
Was there anything to follow up on?
I think, well, one of the other questions that's got lots of thumbs ups on it is there the opportunity to add any of this into the new Medical Capacity Act Code of Practice, and does the code actually go far enough in relation to any of this, which is a really interesting question, because the code doesn't really have anything useful in it, even the draft new one, I don't think, about restraint. There's a couple of paragraphs that in my paper that I did with Nyasha just say, this is what restraint is, remember about section 5 and section 6. But this sort of information isn't really out there, and the really fundamental critical things like you must not use punishment as a way of controlling or manipulating the behaviour of someone. It sounds really obvious, and yet we do still see it in the way, either in the plans themselves or in the way that the plans are actually implemented. And things like that aren't actually spelled out. And I think one of the things that the new code is sort of doing is going back over the case law that's built up since the Act came into force, and then taking all the bits that everyone needs to know about from that and putting it into the new code of practice. But we don't have any case law about this, really extraordinarily. There isn't really any anything that's come from the court saying this is what's acceptable, this is what isn't acceptable. And so I suspect that actually in the revision of the code, there perhaps hasn't been anything like that for them to draw on to then incorporate it.
I don't know. I think the issue for me is the statement that is always written as only use restraint as the last resort. And when you look at the care plan and look at where staff are supported and trained to deliver it, you know that it may be a last resort for them, but actually it's not really a last resort in the way that it should be used, because it implies so much has gone on before that makes it a last resort. But it's often the first resort, second resort, you know, and I think we could get something across like that, you know, because that's using guidance which says, what do we mean by last resort?
Yeah. And last resort is, I mean, it's open to so much interpretation, isn't it? Because you could say, well, this person is living in a communal setting with other people, and one of the things that causes them to be upset is other people being loud. And so in our plan, it says that if other people are being loud, we'll take them back to their bedroom. But actually, the solution to that problem might be that they shouldn't be living in a place with other people. They should be living on their own, where they don't have to put up with other people annoying them, and they can just be in their own living room, and their staff can be, you know, in the room next door, and they can just do whatever they fancy and not have to go through all of these things. And so I think one of the questions I wanted to ask you was, how can, if we say that the court's job is to really scrutinise, is this necessary and proportionate? Is it really a last resort? How can you really say that it is if you haven't tried some of the really significant changes to the environment, not just another training day for the staff, but moving to a different setting and having your own staff team who are consistent and who you train? I mean, there's a kind of, there's a step between them.
I mean, if that was a situation and somebody was living in the environment, I would actually say, what do the assessments tell us about what this person needs? And if what they need is impossible to deliver where they are, then what are we doing by saying you've got to stay? Is it then the responsibility of the local authority to work towards finding a place where their needs are met appropriately? Because I can't imagine what it must be like. It's like, the noise it gets me is that chalk, you know, if I had to live with that every day, I would be going, I'm going to be sitting here calm, seriously. And actually, that's what life must be like for them sometimes. Every day they're subjected to things that are really, really unpleasant and make their lives miserable. Why would we say, oh, we can't move, you know, it's not right to move them, everybody else has got to change the environment? I think we should just be kind and say, we can't change this, there are 5 other people living here who all make noise and do stuff. And that's not to say everyone who's autistic should live by themselves, but actually there are ways of managing things that are better than that.
So a question in the room again here, shall we come back to?
I look through the lens as a mental health service user and a practicing in care. I review these care plans on a daily basis. I wonder, one, what key messages of advice can I be leaving for care providers? Clearly that's for me to manage, but I just wonder, in your experience, what people respond to best. And then, as the ultimate arbiter in these issues, what's the expectation of what local authorities have taken? Is it reasonable steps? Is it assertive action? Is it... What's the expectation when it comes to judgment that authorities have done in relation to ensuring the quality of a PBS? And also, the autistic community is saying that is not fully in favour of PBS. So what can I represent as an advocate against the PBS, as it were?
I think I'd say 2 things. One, some of the elements of the PBS plan are about communication and helping people who find communication very difficult, helping them so that other people understand what they need. And I think there are many, many people in the autistic community who are not capable of telling people what they need. And we shouldn't forget that. And actually, so I think some of the bits of the PBS plan may not be as essential for them as they are for, say, an adult with learning disability who's also autistic. So I think we need to remember that a bit. But I would come back to saying that actually fundamentally what a collaborative PBS plan would have been taken on communication, all the sensory, all the goals, and everything, and said, how do we make this environment and this support right for this person? Because actually they may not be able to change the fact that they find noise horrendous. We need to manage that. We need to make sure they're not put into that stress. That's what you know, maybe we talked about this, didn't we? Maybe we should have an open discussion with people, you know, a proper discussion about what PBS is needed, so that we can actually come to some understanding whether it's useful or not.
I think that kind of answers the question, which I think you were probably addressing to me as well. As what are we looking for? And I am increasingly concerned that PBS is the latest buzzword and it's being stuck as a title on the top of a document which doesn't meet any of these criteria and really is nothing more than a document that says these are the holds we're going to use when we feel we need to. And that's why I think this paper is going to be helpful to all of us in really scrutinising what the court is being told.
You know what I think as well? I think it don't matter what you call it. You can call it a pink fairy. No, honestly, you can. It's not rocket scientists. It's not. It's really well-trained staff and involving the person. My daughter's got autism. So many times things were just imposed on her and she wasn't involved in that process. But if you want to call it positive behavioural support plan, as long as all the assessments are collaborative and you put the person in the middle of that, right at the centre, then it'll work. So to me, I don't care. You can call it whatever you want, but it was transformative for my daughter. You know, and what you should be looking at is you should be looking at really well-trained staff, trained in autism, trained in trauma, because so many of our vulnerable people sadly have trauma from being in this system, yeah, and you involve the person with the care. So 6 months before my daughter got out, yeah, they started to interview staff and she had a real say on what would that staff, and you know what she said? She said, I want happy people. I want, you know, people who are positive. I want people who take me out and do things. And she was involved in the selection of their staff. So she got ownership of that team, and I think you should be looking at that as well, because that's really rare, because so many years they've been detained, they've had everything done to them. And to give ownership, again, that's transformative, very powerful thing, you know.
Can I just say one thing about social workers? Because I think it might have come across wrongly. I wasn't saying they can't do it, but they need to be doing it in collaboration with all the other people. I think anybody trying to write it solely by themselves is going to have a problem. I think it's what I was trying to say, but I don't think it sounded like saying no. I was saying nobody should be doing it by themselves.
I think sometimes we're told, you know, so we couldn't do a sensory assessment, it's got to be done by psychology. Referral goes in 18 months later, you know, waiting for your sensory assessment. So I think there are questions about whether actually, even if it might be ideal for a certain person to do things, there might be a sort of less good but better overall approach of actually making sure that people who are able now can do things.
I suppose there's an issue then about, you know, I'm not sure I don't know how to do a sensory assessment, and I'm sure no team will tell me, but whether I do it very well or not is. So I think it is a bit about using the information you have, if that's all you have, but being aware that where you need more is a really important part of it as well. Because you will know some stuff, because people will tell you, but you won't know it all.
There's an elephant in the room here, and that's resources. For all of this, to do it properly, is resource intensive. But the alternative is equally resource intensive. Paying for a care package of 8-to-1 care all the time is an expense. And so there's a choice that has to be made.
Yeah. Can I say another thing? There's another elephant in the room, as it were, and that's privatisation of acute mental health care. You know, so my daughter was always in private hospitals, and they've done a report recently, and it says when a person with autism and learning difficulty is in a private hospital, they're on average detained much longer than when they're in an NHS hospital. And I'm sorry, but you're looking at profits as well. Yeah, thousands they get, and equity companies and God knows what. So let's talk about profits there and money. There's a lot of money to be made out of my daughter. I'm sorry about it, but this is how it was. And before they put her in hospital at 14, we begged, absolutely begged, because we knew she shouldn't be in hospital. We'd never think she needs to be at home. People love her and understanding things that were meaningful for her. And they wouldn't pay meagre amount of money for a support package, but she'd probably be a millionaire. 15 years. Being detained. Sorry.
No, don't apologise. But on the other hand, let's try not to disappear down a rabbit hole which is beyond our ability to address. So I wonder if there's another question.
Yeah,
Victoria, on
so there's another question that sort of popped up in different places, which is the DOLS process and PBS plans and the sort of link between them. I put something in the paper that I've handed out today and which will be circulated about a case I did years ago, which has got just a couple of paragraphs on this, but I think are really important because it's my case there, but I do think are really important, which says if restraint is being used, that has to be, whoever's doing the best interest assessment needs to know exactly what is going on, and it has to actually authorise the restraint that's in that plan. And then if it changes, you're going to have to redo your DOLS assessment. And so if you're authorising something as a best interest assessor and the care plans include restraint, then you must know exactly what they are, and you must look at the PBS plan and you must analyse whether it's any good or not. So I'm hoping that this paper will be useful to best interest assessors who might look at it and say, actually, I can't authorise this because I've looked at this PBS plan and as you say, it seems to be mainly a list of how to use two-person holds and not so much about what's actually going on. Or they might look at it and say, well, you know, last year this plan was authorised, and since then I'm told that there's been no reduction in the frequency of restraint or only a very small reduction, so I'm not authorising it this year. And I think people are going to have to stop just accepting that the care providers who tell them that something's necessary and proportionate are right, and actually scrutinise things with a much more critical eye. And I feel, I don't know whether Dr. Joyce would agree with this, but we all ought to be approaching this as lawyers from the point of view that there shouldn't be any physical restraint. And so if there is any physical restraint, we should be looking very critically at why that is and what could possibly be done to make sure that it's completely eliminated. And I think that it's really easy to get sucked into a view that you can't eliminate it, and it will be necessary. You look at the Department of Health guidance, positive and proactive care, which is ludicrously titled because it's about restraint. And it says that, in one sentence, there should not be prone restraint. And then a few sentences later, if you're using prone restraint, do it this way. And it's that sort of, if they just came out and said, you cannot use prone restraint, then prone restraint would stop happening. And so it really does feel, I think, that we have a real responsibility to really press these issues and say, no, we're not going to just accept this, and it is going to stop, and it's not going to be authorised. And then you come back and tell us in 3 months why you need it added back into the care plan, and actually it'll turn out that you don't, because when it wasn't in the planning, you couldn't do it, you didn't actually do it.
I think there's a bit of a danger that the person who's being restrained is sort of paying for their restraint, but actually it's an inevitable part of them, and it's back to the behaviour that challenges. It's a challenge to the service and the people around them to actually, because they're not meeting their needs. And that there's all, I shouldn't say, but maybe there's a case for saying if you've got a lot of restraint back on, you're a failing service. And I think that would be it's a real, at least it's a question to ask. And that's not saying sometimes you may have to restrain someone in an emergency or something like that, but for somebody who is year in, year out as part of their plan to be restrained, then why? Why have we got to the bottom of it?
Are there any other questions in the room?
I was told there's a question on the screen about where is a reference for this paper.
Oh yeah, so thank you.
Practical
yes,
matters.
and although I'm doing, I think, quite well at using this Slido thing and not going to be wrong, what I can't figure out is how I can then answer. I don't think I can answer a question on it, which would have been helpful. Probably I can, and I just being incompetent. So the paper that I'm talking about, that I wrote with Nyasha, doesn't exist online. It only exists at the moment on my computer and on some bits of paper here. So the people who are online, we will send you the materials from this evening after the seminar, so you will get it, just not immediately.
What about the paper Dr. Joyce?
Oh, so that one is already on, the link to the one that Dr. Joyce wrote is on the Chamber's website on the booking page for this seminar already. But again, when we send out all the resources, we'll just send that with them as well. So everyone will get that again in a slightly more convenient way.
Thank you. Sorry, over here.
Just you've also spoken a lot about physical restraint, and I wonder if you sort of see chemical restraint or PRN medication, which we often see, if maybe not physical restraint, should sort of be seen the same way, looking at it as a very last option. And again, if they're using that, wanting to have a positive behaviour support plan, and medication being the last resort.
Yeah, I'm doing some work with STOMP.
Could you explain to us who STOMP are?
STOMP is run by NHS England, and it's a programme that is set up to reduce the use of medication and treatment of with learning disabilities and also standard children. Anyway, so there's some training materials coming out. And actually, the aim of that is similar to this actually, and in the document we've written, we are saying also that if you're going to reduce the amount of chemical restraint or medication or antipsychotics for somebody who isn't antipsychotic, you don't do it in the absence of having a good plan in place, which is the person and understand their behaviour. So in a sense, it's the same answer. It's probably being considered in a slightly different way, but it's the same answer. And across the country, there's variation in how supportive people are of reducing medication. There's some work to be done, because actually often all sorts of people think it's okay at the moment, and it only gets triggered if the person's ill or you know, if it's symptom. And people don't want to disturb the status quo. And that's fine. I'm not criticising anyone for that. Why would you? But actually, there's no place. But yes, you'd want some. You wouldn't just reduce medication without making sure there's something that's in place to support the person and the behaviour that may reoccur or may not. We don't know.
Just as a matter of information, on the COP 11 forms for authorising non-contentious deprivations of liberty, the application form actually has the box for restraint followed immediately by the box for sedation with explanations. And the hope is that if you're really wanting to be in the streamlined procedure, you can honestly tick no to both of those. If it ticks yes, that's usually a pretty quick way out of the streamlined procedure.
We probably ought to draw the questions to a close fairly soon. Just some boring bits about sending out the documents. Someone's asked whether they'll be able to share them. Yes, you can. Whatever we send you after this will be something that will be on our website, so you can share that with anyone. If you had asked a question but didn't manage to get it answered, then feel free to respond to the email sending you all the stuff saying, also, could someone answer my question? And as long as there aren't 1,000 of them, I will do my best to try and answer them at some point over the next few days.
Great. Well, I think that's a fairly authoritative underlining to your opportunities to ask questions officially, but I think that there are some drink sessions going on for those of you who are physically here, and I'm sure you can trap Victoria in a corner, at least until she needs to escape from her train. Thank you very much to everybody remote for joining us. I'm afraid we'll raise our glass to you perhaps, but we can't share. But mostly, thank you very much indeed to Dr. Joyce and to Linda Hutchins for joining us and for giving us your insights, which I'm sure are going to spread out like ripples on the pond from this evening, which is exactly the purpose of it. So thank you very much indeed, and thank you, of course, to Victoria for joining. Oh, right.